Hello, everyone. I'm François Picard. Donald Trump's bid to overturn his electoral loss against Joe Biden in 2021 never did end with a trial. In Brazil, different story. The Supreme Court opening the final phase of the case against Trump's far-right ally, Jair Bolsonaro. Ahead, 5 days of testimony and deliberation in spite of political pressure both at home and abroad. Ellen Gainsford has more.
Swaying with hands raised to the skies, they're praying for divine intervention for Brazil's former president, Jair Bolsonaro, as he awaits a decision of the country's Supreme Court.
We can see this kind of support throughout Brazil, but we worried that an injustice could be done, so we had to come here to the Supreme Court. We thank my father's supporters who give him positive energy, which he needs right now.
Currently under house arrest in this high-end housing complex in Brasilia, Bolsonaro is accused of planning a coup to remain in power after losing the 2022 presidential election. The alleged plot included a plan to poison his leftist rival, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, and Lula's running mate, with the aim of installing 2 retired army generals to head the country ahead of fresh elections. Public opinion on the trial is split.
This trial has simply divided the country, divided society into 2 classes, a class that is completely right-wing and one that is completely left-wing. But they forgot the people who are sometimes in the center, who want the country to grow, for it to develop.
Bolsonaro supporters stormed the Capitol in January 2023 in violent scenes that echoed those in the US 2 years earlier. Bolsonaro is accused of stirring up the unrest in order to unseat his rival. His case has drawn the attention of US President Donald Trump, who's called the trial a witch hunt and slapped a 50% tariff on Brazil. Bolsonaro denies any wrongdoing and claims the charges are politically motivated.
Well, for more, let's go to the UK capital. Andreza de Souza Santos is director at King's College London's Brazil Institute. Thank you for speaking with us here on France 24.
Hi, thank you for having me.
The final phase of the trial has begun. You saw in that report a divided nation. Is there a silent majority for or against this trial?
For the trial, in fact, and Bolsonaro still has his supporters, and they have been like a consistent 30% of the population that really supports him. They're very noisy, and 30% of the population, but the majority of the population supports the trial.
So the overall in favor of a trial, what we saw in the United States that it was long and deliberate, the time between January the 6th and the time when in the final year of Joe Biden's mandate that judicial proceedings finally were coming to something of a head. They were all stopped in their tracks by Trump's re-election. Why was justice swifter in Brazil?
There's an interesting point to compare Brazil with the United States, and often enough people do not think that institutions in places like Brazil in the Global South can be speedy and work well. But in fact, Brazil's institutions, and especially since 1988 with Brazil's current constitution, they have been very good. And public servants in Brazil is also a very prestigious and stable career, which recruits very good professionals. And so there is no reason to believe that institutions in Brazil should be slower or worse than in the US or any other country.
The US, where they've slapped sanctions on the president of the Supreme Court, they've also slapped tariffs, and they've statedly said that it's over this trial. The United States targeting Alexandre de Moraes, who addressed that pressure earlier in his opening statement. Let's take a listen.
It is regrettable that another coup has been attempted in Brazil's Republican history.
attacking institutions and democracy itself with the aim of establishing a state of emergency, a true dictatorship.
Your reaction to that statement by this president of the Supreme Court, who's become an internationally known figure now?
Yes, that is a very difficult chapters in Brazil history because it's unprecedented that another country applies trade sanctions on Brazil because of a domestic trial. So it is a very complicated foreign affairs issue, which was not supposed to be like that because this is a trial that the Brazilian Supreme Court is doing against a crime that happened in Brazil. And this is all, Brazilian politicians, for example, when one of the accusations against President Bolsonaro refers to 8th of January in Brasilia. So this happened in Brazil as well. So it's very hard to understand this international intervention. And Brazil is dealing with that, obviously, the best way that is possible, which I guess is negotiating trade and trying to revert some of the sanctions. But above all, I think that the fact that the trial is going on, despite all these punishments, is also a commitment to what we discussed before, with the institutions and the strengths of them in Brazil at this time.
Yeah, and you heard in that clip, he says, Alexandre de Moraes talks about another coup. Of course, he's referring to the fact that Brazil only became a democracy again in 1982. Is it because that memory of times of dictatorship is not so far off that public opinion in Brazil is behind the justice running its course here?
The chapter of Brazil's military coups is complicated because the dictatorship in Brazil, different from other Latin American countries, for example, Argentina or Uruguay, there were very heavy trials. While in Brazil, it was a transition from military dictatorship to democracy. It was pacted. It was a smooth transition. So there were no trials. And the narratives of the military dictatorship in Brazil, they are not so concise. Like there are different appropriations of what happened during the military dictatorship and what happened afterwards, and there were confusion also about democracy in Brazil happening also during a time of decrease in social investment. So you have, in one hand, a democracy and the reestablishment of democracy in Brazil post-military dictatorship. But you also have in the 80s what is so-called the lost decade, which was a decade that was very difficult financially in Brazil. So you have urban sprawl and you have the investment in social services. So a lot of people, they combine democracy with growth in violence, for example, and calls for the comeback of the military dictatorship as a kind of social welfare time, which is, again, this appropriation of narratives and confusions of times and history in Brazil. But when we say now, like this comeback of Coup, this is used in different narratives, as I say. So some people like Bolsonaro will use the military for support to democracy, while, of course, in Brazilian history, the military did not figure as a group in support of democracy, but quite the contrary. So this is a complicated chapter in Brazil's history, exactly because of this pacted transition, the lack of a very strong trial.
Just one final brief question. The president of the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court in Brazil, which has a jurisdiction which is different from that of a lot of Western democracies, in that they can sometimes initiate cases themselves. They don't just wait for cases to come up through the system. Does the Supreme Court have outsized power?
This is actually this is a very good question because it's supposed to be the contrary. It's supposed to give politicians more power. So the idea is that a politician should have a freedom of speech, for example, and in the pursuit of ideas. So to make sure that politicians cannot always be brought to court, then this was a law was created that when is a political crime, it should have to be initiated by the Supreme Court to avoid that every member of the parliament or something is brought to trial because of any kind of judge in a small jurisdiction would feel that they initiated something that is against the law or something like that. So to avoid that there are so many trials against politicians, then there is this kind of parliamentary immunity to justice, and then they need to be initiated by the Supreme Court in the sense that the Supreme Court would be a little bit more elective and filter to not involve politicians in all sorts of criminal charges, and that was to protect. So in the case of Bolsonaro, that's why it is initiated in the Supreme Court.
Andreza de Souza Santos, so many thanks for being with us from London.
Thank you so much.